Oh, all right, guys. I have my friend Lanita on the show today again because I really wanted to dive in FTP, why, how to measure it, why we need it, as I'm on a mission, as I'm sure others are, hopefully, to improve the aging process to get faster, stronger, leaner, more powerful as I age. So, Lanita, you're the expert in the cycling world on FTP, and you teach us on Wednesday mornings. And I am just wanted to dive into this because I think it's interesting.
Absolutely. Heck yeah.
Yeah.
For anybody who rides a bike, right? I think,
Yeah.
it's good
Anyone who
stuff.
rides a bike, I was just saying in the intro, if you ride a bike, you're a triathlete, cyclist, you do spin class. I think, understanding the why of everything is important to figure out what's the purpose of this workout. So, example, your class on Wednesdays, we do all these different workouts. So, hopefully everyone in our class listens to this to understand, oh, why does Lanita do these workouts? Why do we need a 3-minute easy recovery in between this that we just did 20 seconds? So,
Yeah,
understanding the
absolutely.
why is a good reason to listen and research. So why do you know so much about all this? What got
Well,
you
one
into
of the
that?
things that I have done over the years is work as a fitness educator. So helping fitness professionals themselves understand a lot of these concepts so that they can teach their classes effectively and pass on that why that you talked about. Why are we doing this? And especially with indoor cycling, there became a need, I think, early on in the advent of spinning, and that's the brand name, but the generic of indoor cycling.
Yeah, Johnny G
It couldn't
spinning. Is
really,
that
right, it goes way back to those days when we started out, we didn't have a way of actually quantifying any of the work we were doing. So if you think about it outdoors, you get instantaneous feedback about how the effort you are putting out is producing forward speed, right? Are you traveling a distance, slowly? Are you traveling a distance quickly? What works, what doesn't? It's relatively easy outdoors to get some sense, right, of the work that you're doing. Whereas indoors, what we found early on in the early days of spin classes is a lot of people thought it was about pedaling fast, right? So pedaling fast only gets you so far, as outdoor riders know. You take a mountain bike and you put in the granny gear on a smooth, flat surface, you could pedal 120, 140 RPMs and you could be going nowhere very fast at all because you're producing very little power, despite the fact that your legs are turning the pedals over at a rapid rate.
or you could
So
be going somewhere. It might be like sideways,
yeah, it might be
crash,
falling over.
falling over on my bike.
Totally. So we really needed a way indoors to figure out how to give riders feedback about the work that they were doing. And I work for a company called Stages. Stages makes an indoor bike, and they're well known for making power meters also. So they were early in that game, helping riders first outdoors, then indoors, to quantify the work that they were doing. And that's what power meters are all about, is they help us to determine how the work we're doing relates to our current fitness state. Okay. So if you think about it, you wouldn't go in the weight room and just pick up any old weight and start lifting it. You'd want to know if it was a 10-pound weight versus a 30-pound weight versus a 50-pound weight, because they're all very different. You could only do so many reps of a given exercise with each of those weights, and they'd be very different, right? So similar to that concept of quantifying workload, that's what measuring power on a bike is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what power meters do. They measure both the force you are putting into the pedals, and they also have a speed sensor that determines cadence, or the rate at which you're turning the pedals over. Okay, because power is the product of two variables. Product is the power is the product of force, or torque on a bike, which is that circular application of the force, times velocity, or speed, which on a bike is RPM, or cadence, right? So when we multiply those two things, we come up with power, which is a total amount. Well, it's not just the amount of work, it's the rate of the work being done. So with power, there's an element of time. All right, so work is force times distance, but power is work over time. So it's how quickly we're doing that work. All right, so an example might be if you are, let's say you just have a chair and you want to push it across the room. I could do that very slowly and be very comfortable, and I would get the work done. I would get to the other side of the room in let's say 20 seconds. However, if I decided to explosively push that chair across the room, I might be able to get it there in just a matter of a few seconds. I get the same work done, but the rate of that work is much faster, right? So that's power. It's the speed at which that work is being done. So on a bike, again, that's the force you're applying and the cadence you're doing. Cadence alone, as we described in the early days of spin, high rate of turning those pedals around with no resistance on the flywheel, that's going to create a low amount of power, despite the fact that heart rate may become quite elevated.
So you're really not going very far because you're not generating power.
Because you're not doing much work, really. So
So
that's
the people in Soul Cycle aren't really going many miles. They're spinning 110.
I don't want to call out on Soul Cycle or whatever. Because what I have found over the years, and what I do is actually certify indoor cycle instructors for stages. And what I found is, there's good instructors in a variety of different programs. But I think helping our riders to understand what they are doing in class, because that's going to obviously have a direct impact on the results they get. They could come consistently for a long time and not see the results they want if they don't understand this, right? So, how much work we're doing is also directly related to how many calories we're burning, which obviously many people are concerned with. So it has implications, even though you're not perhaps a competitive cyclist.
Yeah.
Right?
So what if most of our listeners are aging athletes, endurance athletes, triathletes, cyclists, if we are trying to get stronger as we age and get faster, why should we be doing measuring our power on our road bike or tri bike or indoor bike as stages, as I've been doing Wednesday mornings? What should we do, or I guess, why should we do it? Would it benefit us?
Well, so we all have different states or levels of fitness, right? Between each other, and even comparing ourselves at one perhaps time of the year to another time of year, or over the course of many years, our fitness level changes. So our work, or the training load that we apply, the overload we apply, needs to be scaled to our current fitness level, right? Because too much overload is too much overload, and it's going to have negative effects. Too little, and we're not going to get the results we want. So using power, we can establish zones or effort levels that are appropriate to our current fitness level. And the most common way to do that is with the measure of basically a benchmark that we call FTP, or functional threshold power. So functional threshold power could be defined as the highest power we could maintain in a quasi-steady state for an extended period of time without fatigue. And that period of time is somewhere around an hour. For someone that's relatively trained. An untrained person may not be able to do that for an hour. But this power, if it's averaged out, and it does take a very intense maximal effort for that duration. It's not a comfortable pace, but it is a sustainable pace. If we can estimate or approximate how many watts that is for us at a given place and time, it provides a benchmark around which we can anchor some zones or training levels that have meaning and have specificity to our individual current state of fitness.
A purpose to the workout.
Purpose to the workout. Scaling it to your ability in a way that will allow you to improve, right? So functional threshold power is a snapshot in time. It's not a number that's, rigid and stuck forever. It's very much something we can improve on, and that will grow over time with an appropriate training stimulus applied.
And that goes with everything I talk about on the podcast and with my clients, is test and not guess, because you don't really know where you are, and you want to meet the client where they're at and get some numbers and then set goals. So we have a plan, and you can personalize it because you know what your FTP is at this moment of time and how to improve that.
Right.
Testing again.
And I think that's so key, Debbie, that testing, because until you know yourself as a rider and where you are, what your tendency is to do is to compare your numbers with someone else's, right? Never
As a
a great
tall
idea.
person, I'm tall and you're short, and I can't say,
Yeah.
"Hey, Lenita, what are you doing?" Because I know you're a rock star. What's my goal going to be?
Well, it's like, do we compare heart rates to, if my neighbor's training at a heart rate of 156, is that necessarily going to be the same effort for me to reach 156? Maybe, maybe not at all, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of personal. We say power is personal, heart rate is personal. It's feedback for you to help make sure that your training is on track with what your body is capable of and needs at that point in time.
But that's
So
why
testing,
we're doing the metabolic testing as
yeah,
the Pinoy testing I'm doing on you and with you.
yeah,
That I think that information we get is more what fuel source you're burning at different heart rates and your respiratory system as well, cardiovascular system. But the FTP that's going to give us more information. So if you're a cyclist, would we want to do FTP and figure out your training program, and even better, have that with a metabolic testing assessment as well to
yeah,
figure
that's
out
a great
what to
combo.
do.
I mean, that's a lot of information for a lot of people to assimilate, but if they have a coach like you who can, put it into really practical, applicable action items to do, it's super helpful. Yeah, I kind of think of it as though heart rate is your body's response to work. It's not the actual work. It doesn't really tell us about performance per se,
Yeah.
right? It's how our body is responding to whatever the performance or work that we're doing. So power, think of that as, rather than the response, it's the actual work we're doing, right? It's the measured energy expenditure, if you will. We can easily from watts calculate calories because they're both about energy. So yeah, it's a really helpful way to kind of calibrate the work based on more than one factor. Personally, I like to use RPE, rate of perceived exertion, percent of functional threshold power, okay, and heart rate all at the same time. I think, triangulating those metrics really gives us a very complete picture, because not one of them contains all the information that we really need to zone in on or zoom in on that specific goal that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that all correlates together, gives clues
Yeah,
to something else. But also you're identifying what we do with the metabolic testing cards, your limiters, what areas of opportunity we identify through testing to know what you need to work on. For example, we'll kind of get into next how to test your FTP, but knowing what areas I need to do more, like you were saying the other day, if you always use 70 RPM at, say your FTP, whatever percentage you're trying to hit, but maybe you should do it at 90 RPM and mix it up. So I think with testing, we get to find out what we tend to always do the same way, and you can identify what areas of opportunity we have because of the way we train, we're not doing enough of. So then you can even be a better athlete by working on the areas that you tend to neglect or get in the habit of doing the same thing over and over again.
I do think that's true. Definitely, Debbie. And I think we all kind of fall prey to patterns, right, and habits. And so we'll tend to favor a specific intensity and perhaps spend all of our time, if not most of our time, in a given energy system training zone, while we neglect maybe some of the others. And if you're an athlete training for a very specific event, right, on your calendar, maybe you really do need to focus just on that one zone or that one energy system. But generally, it's a mix that works the best, even for a performance-oriented person. And when it comes to just overall wellness, longevity, and function in daily life, we really need all of those systems to be working well. And definitely a mix in intensities is going to provide that more than falling into a pattern of, just running at a certain pace, same distance every day for years, and wondering why nothing is changing. So.
Yeah. Well, as I was just saying the other day or yesterday, the definition of insanity, you're, doing the same program over and over again, expecting different results. Like, why am I getting fat? I'm doing all the right things, but I can't figure out. It's like, okay, let's stop, pause, and reset and change how you're training and give a different approach. Like if I've done zone 2 training for majority of my endurance career and I'm now 51, maybe I need to spend more time doing some zone 5 to zone 1 workouts and not just do zone 2. Or a lot of people I'm talking heart rate zones. We'll talk about the difference of your FTP zones to heart rate zones, but say we have 5 zones and FTP is different 7 zones. that I tend to see a lot of people doing that black hole training, that they're not doing the low heart rate, their lower endurance training, and they're not doing the high intensity sprint intervals training, but they're kind of stuck in the middle of the no
Gray
man's gray zone, the black hole.
Yeah,
training.
super common, because in that gray zone, you know, you do feel like you're getting a good workout. It's that kind of, I like to call it comfortably uncomfortable, where you feel like, oh, I'm breathing hard. You know, yeah, I'm having some trouble carrying on a conversation, but I feel good, right? I feel like this sweat I'm getting on has got to be so good for me. But if you go to that same place every single workout, it's too fatiguing to be able to hit the high zones, right? It's not easy enough to recover to be able to perform that. So there's definitely a common mistake made by hitting that same sort of mid zone or gray zone all the time, every time, and not getting the benefits of training on either side of it. So again, identifying functional threshold power and being able to create those zones with power, any program that utilizes that is going to really easily identify when you're falling into that pattern. You're going to be able to see by your wattage and by that feedback from the bike, I'm doing the same exact thing day after day. Let me try a day, lower watts, longer duration. Now let me follow that by a day with some really sharp, short intervals at a higher intensity, big power, right? And recover from it fully and repeat it. So it's getting that more of a polarized approach, if you will. And yeah, you know, it's just kind of dependent on the individual, because like you say, there are many of us that maybe have spent a lifetime in zone 2. But zone 2 is really trending right now, right? Have you
We always called it, yeah, I know. I did a podcast, like, what's zone 2? We've done that
like,
for
what's
20,
so
30
new
years.
about that? That's like what we've been doing our whole life, right?
I know, because we called it Phil Maffetone 20, 30 years ago, created the max aerobic function heart rate. And we, you know, interviewed him many years ago, many times, but we used to always do the 180 minus your age plus 5 or minus 5 if you're sick, or do testing, but figure out this is where you need to train 80% of the time for endurance sports, training for marathons, Ironmans, cycling events, whatever. And then once you're not improving anymore, you can do 3-mile tests for running, say, or cycling once a month. And if you don't see yourself getting faster at that, say 140 heart rate, then you add in speed work. But now I blame Peter Attia and some other people that are out, big influencers in podcast world, that talk about suddenly zone 2. Like, okay.
Yeah.
Not
like,
new to us in our
supposed to be
world.
new? I mean, how's that new?
Okay. So
I think it's like diets, things trend in and out. It's not, nothing's really new.
I know, it's just repurpose it.
Yeah.
So going back to my notes here, what do we want to do how do we test our FTP? Let's kind of, you said 60 minutes, the number you can hold, but I know I read often in the 20 minutes, and I know we did a 5-minute test. So briefly talk about how to find your FTP, and then we'll talk about the zones percentage of that and what that is.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because identifying where that FTP lies is not as easy as it sounds. I mean, in a perfect world, you go out and do on a day when you are 100% well rested, well fed, well hydrated, with perfect conditions and super motivated, you go hit a time trial, you know, somewhere around 40K and see what your average power was, right? Because it'd be roughly an hour. But that's super hard to do. It's brutally hard, and most people are not going to actually follow through with that. So we have easier methods of approximating it. And if not perfect, it gets us close enough that it's extremely useful. And one of them that's commonly used is a 20-minute test. All right. So with that 20-minute test, which was really developed by Hunter Allen and Andy Coggan, there is a very specific kind of protocol, if you will, in assessing that 20 minutes, where you lead into it with a really thorough warm-up, kind of a clearing out, all out 5-minute effort to just kind of dispose of a little bit of the anaerobic energy, kind of take the edge off what you could do, because we're shortening an hour to 20 minutes, more or less. Recover well from that. And then you do that 20-minute best effort. Now, taking that 20-minute average power, multiplying it by 0.95. So basically you're taking off 5% of it, because it's only 20 minutes versus you want something that you could roughly do for an hour. So that's a good approximation, is 95% of your best 20-minute average power. All right. Limitations on that. Sometimes they're kind of big. The first and biggest is pacing. All right. Not everybody knows how to pace a time trial. Goodness knows, for those of us that have time trialed a lot, we're still always having to work that equation. It's super easy to go out too hard, right? And then you drop off too much at the end, and your average power comes out lower than what you truly could have done had you paced it well. So pacing 20 minutes requires some practice and probably a few iterations to get your best FTP. All right.
Hmm.
So a little easier than that, but a little more prone to inaccuracy is to shorten it even more. And what we sometimes use in our ender classes, just for the sake of time and ease of pacing, is a 5-minute all out effort, right? People can somehow pace that out a little better for the most part than 20 minutes. And what we do is we take average power from a 5-minute effort and we multiply it by 0.85. So we take a little more off. And that gets us pretty close to what your functional threshold power most likely is. Another caveat on the 5-minute is if you're, a really highly anaerobically trained athlete. Okay, so like, let's say you do something like track racing or something on the velodrome, you probably have a pretty good anaerobic, or functional reserve capacity, the areas above threshold that you can hang out in and produce big power. Those are probably bigger than a endurance trained road cyclist might have. So you might skew high on a shorter test. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Your number might skew a little high because it favors you a little. But all in all, I think especially for our indoor classes that we're talking about, this gets us close enough to be in the ballpark to be extremely useful. And in my opinion, more useful than just heart rate alone by far. Because it gives you feedback from which you then have something to compare. You know that, hey, I'm in this class. I did this interval the instructor asked me to do for 2 minutes. She is going to ask me to do it again. I'm going to get a recover. We're going to repeat that 5 times. I at least have a benchmark. I know what I did the first time. Can I beat that? Can I do better? Right? So it gives you a target. It gives you a goal. It keeps you really, really focused, and you get better results.
What do cyclists normally do? Do they do, if they don't do a classes, because there's not many Lanitas around the country teaching a spin class like this, because it's
I hope
based
there are
on
more and
cyclists.
more. I've trained quite a few, and so have my Stages colleagues. So there are more and more indoor classes that are trying to work off this, but you're right, not all. Some of them prefer to dance to the music, which is fine.
Yeah.
It's just on my
No judgment, but if you're a
I want
cyclist and you're
results,
out on your
baby.
bike and you don't want to go to class, would you do a 20-minute? I mean, I know we used to do a test, like a 5-mile test. Would you go find a country road with no stop signs and just see how hard you can go for 20 minutes?
That's the hard part, is finding a road that, you don't have to any kind of worries about cars or stop signs or stoplights or dogs running out in front of you.
Yeah, dogs.
So for sure, you can absolutely do it outdoors. I think the trainer's a way to go, though. It's a little gnarly. It's a little uncomfortable. Not gonna lie. No, I don't know anybody that loves it. And yet it's really useful. So you can get yourself to do it at least a few times. You're going to get a pretty good idea of what the number looks like. And, depending on your training, it's going to shift up, it's going to shift down. And you're going to need to retest it from time to time, especially when there's been a big change in your training or your lifestyle or whatever. Because that number fluctuates.
Is that like quarterly, get it done? Or
Yeah, I mean, most coaches recommend for somebody who's really working on this to retest every 6 weeks is a standard recommendation. I think it's a little bit more frequent than my classes are willing to do. We try to get it done quarterly. And people learn to downward adjust a little bit when they are looking at their FTP. If, for example, they know they've been off for a few weeks or, they've been a little less consistent with coming to class. So there are ways you can, modify it just based on what you've been doing over time. If your training volume has decreased significantly or training quality, yeah, you're going to take a few watts off, probably know that it's dropped a little bit. But ideally, you're going to retest it, especially when you want precision, like some of the people you're working with who are also doing the PNOE testing, and they really want to be training the right energy systems when they think they are based on those zones that are anchored on that FTP. So if the FTP is wrong, you can't get the zones right,
Yeah. So just to summarize there. So if you're doing a 20-minute test, you find your watts you've held and then times it by what?
So then you're going to take 95% of that. So you
95.
multiply it by 0.95.
And then the 5-minute is 85%.
85. Yeah. And with both of those, and maybe it goes into detail we don't need to get into, but what's really important with any kind of test and retest protocol is that you do it the same way each time.
Mhm.
So there is a warm-up type of protocol, and you want to repeat that the same way each time you test. So you're comparing apples to apples,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Same
Yeah,
with our PNOE testing. If you're test it the
100%.
same, if you're going to do it this way, do it each time. Okay. So we
Right.
get the test, we get our number. We're doing the 20-minute times that by 0.95 or the 5-minute time 0.85. Then what do we do with that information? How
Well,
do
so
we
what
use
that
it?
number represents or is trying to approximate is what we used to test in the lab, which is lactate threshold, right? There's so many terms that describe that threshold and different ways of determining it. There's onset of blood lactic acid, there's maximal lactate steady state, there's anaerobic threshold, ventilatory threshold too, and such. But all of these are broadly the same. They're trying to identify, a physiologic sort of threshold. As you say, crossing threshold is crossing from a particular type of conditions into a new set of conditions, right? And that new set of conditions beyond threshold is where anaerobic energy systems predominate. Okay. So below threshold, the aerobic system predominates. Okay. And as we know, it's a continuum, it's not a light switch on off, aerobic to anaerobic. All three energy systems are being utilized at pretty much any given time to some degree. But what we do find, and you can see this in the lab with your PNOE testing, if we look at a progressive workload over time and rate of perceived exertion, or an individual's sense of how hard that effort is as it's ramped up slowly and continually, up until threshold, there's a pretty linear relationship between the increase in work intensity and the perception of effort. It's fairly linear. We go from 1 to a 2 to 3 to a 4 to a 5, just talking out of 10.
Mhm.
Somewhere around a 6, 7 is typically where people hit that point where their breathing rate is steady and regular and it's sustainable, but there isn't room for conversation between breaths, maybe a yes or a no. It's a point at which they wouldn't describe the work as comfortable, right? It's now work that is challenging, difficult. There's an ongoing sense of some type of physiologic stress, right? But it is still sustainable. Those are all signs that we're getting pretty close to threshold. All right. So that's how we look at it from the RPE state of things.
Yeah.
Past that threshold, once you're past it, because the curve becomes, it goes from linear to curvilinear, right? So RPE goes very, very quickly from around a 7 to a 9, 10. It's just whoop, as the workload increases, the duration that we can hold that workload just shortens dramatically because now those anaerobic energy systems are predominating. And as we know, those energy stores are limited. Yeah, they expire. They won't carry us as far as those endless aerobic stores, i.e.
Yeah.
fat. So yeah, so now I forget your question, but
No, just what to do. So now, what do we do with it? So
okay.
we get the zone. So talk about the zones, and then I want to get into how to train
Yeah.
if we're trying fat loss performance or just want to improve the
Okay.
aging process, or how to train as we age. So let's talk about the zones.
So yeah, that I remember where I was going is we're trying to identify a physiologic, phenomenon known as threshold. And we're trying to identify it based on work, which is on the bike power output. All right. So that power output at that point in time is kind of your body's maximum ability to work aerobically. That's what it is. So now we know that's our benchmark. That's our anchor point. Below that, we're going to create some zones that aerobically, trained systems. And above that, we're going to create some zones that call increasingly on those anaerobic systems. So typically with cycling, we use a 7-zone model. Zone 1 would be your recovery zone, right? Super easy, just chilling, recovery, less than 55% of that FTP is where we hang out in zone 1. Zone 2 would be the zone we use for aerobic endurance or base training. Very aerobic, very comfortable. You can do it for extended periods of time. This is all the way up to about 75% of that functional threshold power. Okay, so we're basing it on power zones now, power ranges. Above that, we have tempo. Tempo is at where sweet spot lies. It's kind of it's sort of comfortably uncomfortable. Feels like we're getting a good workout. It's our happy place, right? When we like to exercise. But if we spend all of our time there, we get diminishing returns, right? And you can't keep that up forever. I mean, hey, if you're in tempo for a 3-hour workout, it's pretty killer hard. It really, really is. So tempo is more like that 1 to 2 hour ride that you're working pretty hard. You're probably going to average out to have spent a fair amount of time in tempo. And then zone 4 would be threshold. So it's a range of power now that it goes from about 90%, 91% of your FTP up to 105% of your FTP. So it's a range slightly below to slightly above that functional threshold power that we consider zone 4 threshold. Training in that zone is really beneficial in terms of upping our functional threshold power. It's also basically our race pace zone. So if you wanted to monitor your power during a race, you're going to be seeing numbers that fall in that zone if you're given a best effort for, you know, a 20 to 40K type of ride, right?
Yeah.
And then we have zone 5, which is VO2 max. VO2 max is 106 to 120% of our FTP. This is a great place to spend some time pushing that ceiling of aerobic capacity up, which is the maximal rate at which we can utilize oxygen, or VO2 max. Zone 6, anaerobic capacity. All right, now we're looking at intervals that we can't sustain for more than a couple minutes. They're that intense. They're calling on the glycolytic system predominantly, and they are not sustainable. They're going to be up on that rate of perceived exertion scale of somewhere around an 8 to a 9. Okay. Then we have zone 7, neuromuscular power. And this is the top end of that curvilinear description I made of functional reserve capacity, the anaerobic zones above threshold. That's where it goes zip way up here, right? Now we're looking at over 150% of your FTP, and it could be well upwards of that, 200, 250, 300%, depending on how short that sprint interval is and how strong a given individual could be. So at that point, we are training neuromuscular power, our ability to produce force at a high rate, right? And really generate a lot of speed for things like a sprint or for true HIIT interval training. I think HIIT interval training, that term is sometimes misused because we're not actually measuring the work we're doing. But it's that high. It's 150% and more of the FTP. It's not 120. It's not 110.
High as you can go.
Right? And it forces recovery. You cannot repeat it without a recovery. So it's really helpful to me in teaching classes to have people be able to experience what that feels like. Because once they experience this, they get why they can't do it again in 10 seconds, right? Your body needs time to recover and replenish that ATP, CP, that energy that's stored locally within the muscle cell itself.
Yeah, I just did a podcast on creatine. So I went over the science of creatine phosphate, but that's an energy source you're using as a stored fuel in the muscle. Yeah. So kind of summarize then each zone fuel source. So you're burning more higher percentage of fats, more aerobic zone 1, 2, and then 3 is kind of threshold, more kind of combo. What would you say?
So think of it. I like to first explain that these zones that we, as you know, for lack of a better method, we make them very kind of concrete. They aren't. They're sort of continuous. And so in terms of the substrate utilization, you know, there's a blend all throughout those 7 zones. It's a blend of fuels. But the ones I like to speak of it in terms of the ones that predominate, all right? The ones that
so it's never 100% fat or 100%
correct.
Carbs is always a combo.
Yeah. So if we remember what FTP represents, which it literally is trying to replicate what we often would measure in the lab of that ventilatory break point or that lactate threshold. It's where our body is transitioning from predominantly using fat as fuel into using increasingly greater stores of carbohydrate to get the work done, simply because the work is hard enough, fast enough, short enough, there isn't time to do the work aerobically with oxygen for the heart and the cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen to the working muscle to get the work done. It has to be done quickly and at a high rate, and that requires that anaerobic energy. So that said, I guess to answer your question, you know, fat is the predominant fuel when we're sitting still at rest, right? It's a predominant fuel in zones 1, zones 2, zones 3. Zone 4, we're getting more of a mix. Some people call that kind of where it's 50-50, all right? And then anything above zone 4, 5, 6, and 7 in particular is pretty much entirely carbohydrate, stored carbohydrate. And zones 5 and 6 would call on those to a high degree as well. That said, that does not mean that working in those higher zones is going to mean you don't lose fat,
Mhm.
right? And you're still going to be utilizing so many more calories at those higher effort levels that fat loss is a very likely outcome, provided diet is what it needs to be, right? Because, of course, there's that piece to it. What we do know, and I find this really interesting, is there are some studies and on, in particular, midlife women, and one in particular that was super interesting about a control group who were walking. They weren't cycling, they were walking, but they were spending all their time in the quote unquote fat burning zones. Another group was doing high intensity interval training, everything above threshold. All right. Small volumes of work. I think the total amount was somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes that they were actually working in intensity. And the only group that changed body composition and the only group that lost visceral fat was, guess who? The high
Mhm.
intensity trainers. Yeah. So there's definite benefits, especially for certain populations of
I
hitting those in a way that, provides a quality of work that gets that done.
And
Yeah.
that's why I think it's confusing for people to think if they're trying to lose weight, they're doing more cardio and doing that low zone. You see people at the gym workouts, they're just on the elliptical, or they want to lose weight, burn fat. They tend to focus on, I'm going to exercise more and eat
Yeah.
less instead of figuring out, well, maybe I've been doing this for a while. It's not working anymore. I've created that base. I've been doing
Right.
zone 2 for a while. Now my body is primed I've got a foundation that I can go hard and recover.
Yep.
So you are saying
And I
you're
think,
higher intensities and you have kind of, we'll get into that. If you're doing that, the recovery part, how essential that is. Cause I think people might do speed work, but they don't
mhm,
really do it, but they don't do it right because they don't recover. And then they start to do
yeah,
it every day. Think more is
that's a
better.
really common mistake.
Yeah.
And that's not really what they think it is. And that's why the feedback from something like a power meter is useful. But back to what you were saying about, the same thing not working. And when it comes to the aerobic work or the, long, slow days versus the higher intensity interval drains days, it's not like I'm saying, and I just want to be clear on this, that we shouldn't be doing that aerobic based work. It's
Yes.
really important. But I think the majority of us that are endurance athletes, we kind of got that down,
Yeah.
right? Kind of got that down. And
For
what is
25
more
years.
often
What year is
missing,
it? I've been
yeah,
doing that
what is
forever.
more often missing is the high end stuff, right? And if we do too much of the low end stuff, we don't have just the energy or time to do the high end stuff. So it's sort of a less is more concept, not a all or none. Not like, okay, forget about all that. Don't ever do it again. Just do these high intensity intervals. It's like people get so binary in their thinking. We're just talking about shifting our emphasis away from just that, maybe a little less of that to fit in a little more of this. And you might see everything take off, your performance, your body comp, your mental status. It really provides some benefits that you don't necessarily realize by continuing with that same pattern you've always done. So
Yeah. Insanity.
yes, yes, sorry, not to revert to that.
I know, but that's
But
what, go ahead. I just,
well, you asked a question about recovery.
yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
was going to say. I think so I'll just add in most people, I think, started doing more hit training with Tabata started being popular and all the classes and the studios started coming out years ago because I owned my studio for 10 years and I could see all this happening because I was paying attention to these trends. And of course, everyone thrives on more is better and not with my mantra, less is more, that they think, okay, I can lose weight if I do hit training. And now it becomes this trend that they're doing it every day. They think they're doing hit training. And this is why I keep talking about doing testing because you don't know how hard to go and how to recover. And you probably aren't even doing it. If you're doing it back to back day, there's no way you're recovered to do it again.
right,
So it's
right,
the
right. You're
importance
either
of
not doing
testing.
it right or you're going to break down because the reality is that's the kind of work, those high intensity intervals that, you can read in books 3 times a week, 4 times a week. I have found in, just my personal practice, it's more like 2 times a week
Mhm.
that is actually doable for most people. If you're an athlete training for a specific goal and you can fit in 3 days a week, great. But it's definitely not something that you can do on back-to-back days effectively, nor should you. There aren't increased benefits from that.
Mhm.
There's actually increased benefits from, like, once again, a certain amount, but not the more is better mindset. So 2 days up to 3 days a week on the interval training, and then recovery in between might look like active recovery. We're really keeping things pretty easy and zone 1 type. It might mean a long endurance day. Yeah, throw in a couple of those. That's great, right? We need to keep that aerobic base. We need the health benefits that it, elicits. But having the variety and training intensity is key. And then recovery within workouts was the other thing you were talking about. In other words, being able to do multiple repetitions of an interval that is above zone 4, 5, 6, and 7, those higher end intensity intervals, it necessitates recovery. And the higher the zone, the higher the power output, the more recovery it necessitates, the longer the duration that recovery has to be. And that ratio of work to rest, there's no one size fits all. I could give you some general guidelines, but a lot of it depends on the individual, their state of training, what their goals are, what zone they're in, if it's 5, 6, or 7, and how many repetitions of that interval they want to achieve. Because what you want are peaks and valleys of power output that's high and then very low enough to allow your body to recover, replenish those energy stores, and repeat it and do it again so that you get that training adaptation over time, right? And initially that might be 3 intervals, and then you can't do it anymore. That's all you got. But it's trainable. So over time, that 3 may become 6, right? And so we can improve our anaerobic capacity and our ability to perform high intensity work, just like we can improve learning to run 2 miles all the way to 6 or 7 or 8, right? Our aerobic endurance.
That's what I was listening to a podcast. My friend Brad Kearns did on sprint training and more regarding track. But if your times or your watts for our conversation are not they're getting lower, you're done. So say you're trying to do 3 and I had the plan to do 5, but I'm actually getting slower, not faster, or less watts. That's when I'm cut it off.
Once again, this is where RPE falls short. This is why we need this triangulation of RPE, heart rate, and watts, because as you repeat those efforts, your heart rate is still going to be equally high, even when the work you're doing or the power you're creating with those efforts has dropped significantly. At that point, if you're just looking at heart rate, you wouldn't know that the intervals you're doing are not having the desired effect. In other words, they're not creating the overload that will lead to the adaptation you're after. It's just more fatigue. You're just putting yourself in a condition where you're going to have more fatigue, not more benefits, not more adaptations, just more fatigue. We don't need that.
We don't need that.
Yeah, I think it was Joe Friel that said something like, we want to do, well, I'm going to misquote it, but it's basically the concept is the least amount of work possible to get the desired result. Because anything beyond that is just excessive fatigue we're creating and increased risk of injury, burnout, overtraining, etc.
Yeah. And people are are really good at doing that. Overtraining.
I mean, a general rule of thumb on that is so let's say we're doing a set of 5, you might not use your first interval power feedback just because the first one is kind of clearing out the cobwebs, open things up. It's not going to be your best. But from that second interval, the average power you did there, if it's dropped off by more than 5 to 10%, several intervals later, give it one more shot. And if it still's dropped 5 to 10% lower, you're done. That's it. Call it. Doesn't matter if there's more workout to be done. You're not going to have the benefits that you want. You're not ready for it on that given day for whatever reason. So,
and what's your kind of guidelines for recovery? For if we're doing what zone, the higher we go, what is the recovery kind of estimated time frame for each?
Right. Okay. So as we kind of mentioned in general, that's going to depend on the number of repeats. I'm going to assume in answering your question, it's not 1 or 2. It's a set, of 5 to 6 to 8. If you're in zone 5, right, those intervals in general are 3 to 5 minutes in length. Some people say up to 8. That's like really pretty brutal. I don't necessarily recommend it. So 5 to 8 minutes. So you're going to probably need, it could be anywhere in the order of 1 to 1, 1 to 1.5, so if you're doing a 5-minute interval, maybe you need 5 to 8 to recover, and then you do it again. Once you get up to zone 6, now you're looking at intervals that are like, 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe at most. At that point, you're probably going to need more recovery between them. So 1.5 to 2.5 times as long. All right. once you're up to zone 6, or did I just say 6? I just said 6.
Yeah. 7.
Yeah, zone 7, you're going to need anywhere from 4 to possibly 8 times as long. So zone 7, those intervals are less than 30 seconds. You know, at the very most, they're 30 seconds. So if you take 15 seconds, you do an all-out sprint, you hit the highest power number you can, your heart rate is not going to be anywhere near maxed out by the time you finish the interval. It's going to lag way behind, way behind. So it's not going to be a good indication of effort. You want to be able to see power. You want to be able to capture what your average power was for that 15 seconds. And you're going to probably need to recover for 4 to 8 times as long. So what, up to a minute, up to 4 minutes? I don't know. Depends on how many of these reps you're doing. Okay. And everybody's a little different. So these are very broad guidelines. But point being, you need more recovery as the interval shortens, assuming you're at a higher zone, right? Each time.
I just wanted to go over that because I think a lot of people don't let that happen. They're like recover 30 seconds.
Yeah. They feel like they're not getting a workout if they're going easy. So it's kind of really a common mindset for endurance athletes in particular. We're used to going continuously and long and not stopping. And I don't know if I told you this last time too, but when I first started riding on the velodrome, I came from a world of endurance sport, you know, triathlons, Ironman, all that. And here I was on the track. I had then switched to time trialing on the road, and then now I've come down to the track. Now our distances that I'm training for are 2 kilometers, 500 meters to 2 kilometers. It's a whole different world. So the coach would have me do an effort, and I would do it, whether it's 1 lap, 2 lap effort, whatever. And then I wouldn't stop. I would just keep riding around because I thought, what are all those people going down sitting on the infield for? That's like a complete waste of my time. I'm going to keep riding, right? I want to work out. Until he about wrung my neck and said, get off the track, sit down, get your legs up, recover. And next time I want it 5 seconds faster, right? So in other words, I wasn't performing at the intensity he was asking of me. So I didn't need the recovery. But because I didn't take the recovery, I couldn't get to the intensity he was talking about. So there's something about, getting that actual real recovery in there that enables us to kind of explore some territory up there that we honestly, sometimes as endurance athletes, we don't even recognize it's there. And once we can kind of find it and cultivate it, we can actually grow it, right?
Yeah.
And we can do more work and we can perform at higher levels that, again, all have a different kind of benefit to our physiology.
So
and that's also where the whole endorphin thing kicks in big time. Big time. I haven't experienced as much of an endorphin rush from any kind of endurance workout as I have with high intensity intervals. And there's literature to back that up. So that's another benefit, although there's also the pain.
Pain cave. Well, that's what we talked last time about being so, you know, Forrest Gump, I can go forever, comfortable zone 2, you know, the low heart rate training, but to do all out 20, 30 seconds is something I'm learning how to go deep into that pain cave to learn how to do. And it's a process when I've done Ironman and marathons, 50K races, where it's all about, you know, going as fast as you can at your zone, you know, aerobic zone, whatever zone 2 you want to call it.
Persevering for a long
and go long and survive and be able to, you know, win your age group, be top in your age group because you're able to pace yourself. Now it's different that I have to learn, don't hold back, just go hard or go home.
and it's so funny on the bike too, because I go back to the track and I think, okay, I couldn't figure out how to leave it all on the track because I was used to getting off my bike and having to run. Right? And so it took me a while to figure out that, no, you should literally be falling off your bike when you finish that 2K. You should not be able to stand up.
Well,
I'm not recommending this to the entire world. Some of us are just freaks that like this stuff, but
well, most people listening probably are. So that's a question for most of our listeners. If you are a triathlete and you're trying to do swim, bike, and run speed work once a week, or you're saying twice a week bike workouts to do the high intensity interval training, it gets confusing how to fit in a swim and a bike and a run hit training, high intensity recovery, go hard again for each sport.
And that is true. That's kind of a scheduling question, isn't it? And it's not easy. I think with the pool, that's typically built into most swim works out. Oh, you know, you do a week worth of swim workouts. You're going to have a variety of distances that you're doing your intervals at.
Fast
the
Friday, we
100
do
or
Fast
200
Friday.
piece now and then. I think, you know, for a triathlete, it might be different. When I threw out the 2 to 3 days a week, I was thinking of a cyclist only.
Yeah,
For a triathlete, you might only get 1 day on the bike like that, and then maybe you get 1 day on the track like that, and a day or 2 in the pool, you know?
yeah.
Um,
And it's funny, I've been taking this information. We've been talking more this past year about the high intensity interval training, the Stacy Sims, 20, 30 seconds. But in swimming, because they do the workout sets and you have send offs and you have like some coaches call it gear 3, gear 5 is your hard gear, but they'll change the send offs, but it's really giving you 5-10 seconds of rest. So I'm like, I keep saying that's not really true speed work because
yeah,
I
yeah.
only have like 5 seconds to go. So I'm probably in zone 3 doing kind of anaerobic tempo the whole time if I'm not fully recovering. But then I got the
Mhm.
coach last week finished our workout with 650-meter swims all out, but we had 2 minutes send off time. So we had pretty much a minute and a half recovery. I
Yeah,
go, finally, that's a true
yeah,
speed workout. But typical
right.
swim workouts, I'm finding no one does the rest-based training type of
Mhm,
intervals.
mhm. Yeah, I guess that is true. Most of it is more endurance based. But they do vary the distances enough that you are challenging your body in different ways. You know,
Mhm.
swimming a 500 isn't like swimming 5 100s,
Yes.
physiologically. Yeah.
Yeah. So, uh, other questions as we finish up. I don't know how the hour we start a few minutes late, but it goes so fast. So we talk about heart rate, signs of recovery overtraining. I want to talk about because we mentioned it a little bit, but signs that you're. So I was reading over your book you let me borrow, but the way you can use power meter or your watts to know when you aren't hitting those numbers, when you need to probably just take a day off or not.
Yeah.
I mean, how
Yeah.
much that information you can get from your bike.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, kind of mentioned briefly that if you're looking at repeats of a given interval length and you're looking at the average power you're able to achieve, when you see that 5 to 10% drop, and I'm using a range of 5 to 10% because basically the shorter it is, the shorter the interval is, the higher the power is going to be. Then you might keep doing them until you lost about 10% of your power. A little bit longer interval of 5 to 10 minutes, you might stop doing them once you lost about 5% of your average power. So that's one way to kind of calculate when enough is enough, right? Um, if you go out on a given day and you are unable, let's say your heart rate is in the zone you think it should be, that's associated typically with what you do zone 5 intervals at. But your power feedback, you're looking at your bike and you're like, I can't get out of zone 4, but my heart rate is in zone 5, or it correlates with a power zone of zone 5 and what I've seen in my prior workouts. Well, that could be an indication to you to kind of think through what's going on. Am I fatigued? Am I getting sick? Am I dehydrated? What's going on? Why am I getting this elevated response, heart rate is response to the work or the power I'm producing? Yeah, so you have 2 things to look at and kind of more information to base, what you do about it on.
Yeah, I think more so when you're going out on your road bike or tri bike,
Yeah.
like going outdoor cycling, that you can get information of when you need to listen to your body, as I keep saying, is that you need to learn how to, use all your biometrics. You're collecting all this data to know when is appropriate to do a hard workout. When is it appropriate to skip that, reschedule that workout to a day that you are feeling ready to go,
You're feeling
balls to
ready
the
to go.
wall. Hard.
Absolutely. And I think I don't have a problem at all if an athlete, that I work with or something, they get out there and they can't do the work of a hard day. And they say, you know what, this day needs to be more of a recovery day for me. It's like, great. So we still do need to definitely have those longer, easier days. And a power meter is helpful to keep us at a low intensity as well, seeing the feedback. Let's say we want to do a road ride, but we're with some friends. It's supposed to be basically a recovery day for us, right? And the friends don't have necessarily the same agenda. Well, we'll kind of get sucked into doing what they're doing. Where if you have that feedback on your power meter and you consistently seeing your numbers, up in zone 3 or 4, you know that you're not getting what you set out to do, which was to recover and to keep those numbers low. And power is what they call stochastic. I don't know why they use that big word. It just means variable. They're highly variable, right? How you press on the pedal, what your technique is like. Just by nature, most of us don't put out super steady power. It kind of wanes and surges from time to time. And then conditions, is it windy? And we want to
Mhm.
go a certain speed. We don't calculate that the wind is impeding that or aiding that. So there's many reasons why power is highly variable on the road. There are ways of getting your average power at the end, but even during the ride, you can kind of look at how much of the time you're spending, in lower power numbers, even if they are highly variable and they're moving around a bit. If you're seeing that they get up to, 150% of your FTP, well, you're not supposed to be there. You might have to get up a short little hill and do something like that. But in general, it's a good way to get feedback to keep your ride of a low intensity when you need to also.
That reminds me of years ago when I was racing, everyone started using power meters on their bike. And I'm like, I don't want to buy something else. I'm fine and I'm a strong cyclist. Why do I need that? But I think I always questioned if people were just using their power meters and going by their FTP when they're doing an Ironman. They had their whole training schedule. I'm going to do an Ironman at this FTP or this watts, whatever you call it, for a race. This is what I'm going to hold. And I always thought, well, how do you know if that's right? If it's going to be a hot race or windy race, if you're dehydrated, you're already stressed out, your heart rate's higher, how do you just learn to listen to your body and not have
And that's
focus
where
on those
RPE
numbers?
comes in. I mean, by definition, in Ironman, there's no way you're going to hold your FTP because remember, that's the most you can do for an hour. So clearly, that's going to be well below that.
Yeah, the percentage
That
of
you
it,
would
I
want to
meant.
be hitting would be maybe 75 at most. I don't even know,
Mhm.
that might be way too much. But you'd want to be down in zone 2. So just to be able to sustain it and put out that steady power. But you're right. You also have to calculate how your body feels, right?
Yeah.
And what the conditions are doing to it. And so it's one of several pieces that I recommend listening to. But
Combination.
itself, just by itself, it's not adequate because it's subject to so many other influences. It can
Mhm.
be influenced by just cardiac drift over time, right? We know
Yeah.
that. It can be influenced by hydration status, by medications, by caffeine, by blood glucose levels, by stress, by psychological stress, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So you always have to kind of remember to take it with a grain of salt as well. And when you
Mhm.
combine those other elements, okay, heart rate's saying this. How do I feel? Because I've had clients, and maybe you have too, where this is interesting because she's actually a physician, but she was really married to these heart rate zones and saying, I'm starting running, and I'm feeling great. I don't understand. My heart rate is so high. You know, I'm feeling like I'm a 6 on a 1 to 10 scale in terms of rate of perceived exertion, but I'm at my max heart rate. And I'm like, okay, if you're running 3 miles, I promise you're not at your max heart rate. How did you calculate that max heart rate? So again, we know that some of the methods out there by which people derive their max heart rate are incredibly inaccurate, right? Um, and so clearly at an RPE of 6 and feeling like she could run more, we know we had way underestimated her max heart rate because that was showing up day after day. And she wasn't actually a client of mine. She was just a friend that I was kind of helping troubleshoot. I said, yeah, you need a running coach. You need some help with this.
Yeah. So
Um,
lastly though, can we I know our last podcast talked about getting stronger, but how, if you get this and you want to improve your FTP test next quarter, I'm going to test it, or 6 weeks, how do I
yeah.
get stronger, more powerful?
Well, ride more, ride more and incorporate some of the training principles that we've talked about where you're getting that, you have that aerobic base. What you and I kind of just discussed, and just to be clear for everyone listening, that high intensity interval training is best implemented after you've established some type of aerobic base, right, in that given sport. So you've developed that aerobic base. Now you're layering on some of these higher intensity intervals. You're still working on increasing perhaps the duration of those aerobic rides. That's going to create a stronger athlete over time.
Mhm.
Your efficiency on the bike is going to improve along with your muscular strength and your muscular endurance. If you are coupling that with some strength work in the gym, it can only help you as well to be able to produce more force and deliver more force as you practice being able to ride perhaps a higher cadence. If you're a newer rider and you hover down in the 70s, if you can get efficient pedaling up in the 80 to 90 RPM range, you're going to be able to produce more power without fatigue. So there's lots of little pieces to it, but consistency is first among them. Yeah,
Yeah.
FTP will go up if you're consistent. Yeah.
But what if you don't have a part-time job as you, and you can bike 4 or 5 days a week?
Right, right. Well, I think if you can get in 3 to 4 days a week, and you can come up with a program or be coached in a program where you are basing it off to FTP. You're giving yourself, an hour to maybe a couple of hours. Let's say you can get out for a couple of hours on the weekend. So per workout, you're going 1 to 2 hours. And you're sprinkling in those high intensity days with some longer steady state days. I think that's a good recipe for most people to be able to see improvement in both their aerobic fitness and their FTP. People who
Yeah.
want to race, who want to compete, yeah, it's a higher demand is necessary often to get the improvements because they're already at a level that's fairly reasonable, and they want to go to somewhere above that.
Yeah, I like as I get older, the minimalist approach and the minimal effective dose. How
Those,
can I?
yeah, it's all relative to your goals, isn't it?
Yeah,
What's
it is.
good for enough for a person looking for health benefits is not the same as for someone who wants to, perform at a race in PR, right?
Well,
So,
that's what I was, didn't get as much into, but in another podcast, but how to improve fat loss versus performance gain versus just, I want to improve the aging process, and different types of training programs based on those 3 different goals are going to look different than
yeah,
someone that's got a big race to do and how
yeah,
to fit it all in.
totally. And it all has to start with, where do I want to be? Where am I going? What is my goal? And, as coaches, of course, that's where we want to start, because the program is going to be worked backwards from that. So you're right. Those 3 goals that you mentioned, what, longevity, health,
Fat loss and
performance,
performance.
fat
Mhm.
loss. Okay. Different approaches, right? Different minimum effective dose as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's key. Less is more, more is not better. And then again, we talk all the time about the holistic method. My approach is the nutrition exercise, but as you talk too, and you've got that, but what about your sleep? Prioritizing your sleep and quality
Yeah.
sleep, because
That's a
that's
whole nother
recovery, your stress
piece of it.
management, because those 2 things, if you have too much stress and you're not sleeping, well, they go hand in hand almost, but everything else is disrupted. And so, working on digestion and gut health, and I talk about movement throughout the day, and just all the other elements are so important to improving your overall performance. If whatever those 3 goals, if it's fat loss, performance, or longevity, you have to prioritize your sleep and eating real
Yeah.
food and giving your body time it needs to recover and repair in between workouts. Cause I think we forget all that.
Yeah. Of course, we didn't have time to mention it in this podcast, but you're so right. Everything
Yeah.
we've said is dependent on those other domains as well, being what they need to be. It's all intertwined.
Yeah.
all
Well, we'll have to
intertwined.
just record another podcast for the series with Lenita.
Always more.
I think it'd be my new co-host, come on once in a while, talk shop. All right. So where can we find you? The big question,
I know,
Lenita, do you
Debbie.
do coaching?
I don't
We're
have a
creating,
website.
we're creating a website for Lenita
Yes. Yes.
eventually.
Yes.
So,
Eventually.
and
Otherwise,
she's,
yeah, I'm on
you can
Instagram.
ask me how to find her if you
Facebook.
want Lenita to do coaching with
Ask
you.
Debbie. Perfect. Perfect.
Because she's not on social media. She doesn't have a website, but she's got good established coaching career and does it the original way that you just email or call her before all the other crap that we have to do.
All right. Well, we'll fix that.
Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Debbie. Fun chatting with you.